Patrick Costas here. I wanted to talk to you a little bit on this beautiful day, which is rare in Washington State. Well, at least it has been lately. But I think America has seen better days as well. And I think one of the reasons we have so many problems, nowadays has to do, and in the world in general, because of our interventions in the world. I can give you numerous examples of where that has ended up badly for us. Every time we intervene in the internal affairs of another nation, it turns around not just to hurt the host, but to, not just to hurt us, but to hurt the very nation that we're trying to help as well. This type of policy, this has been United States government policy going back to World War II. After that time frame, we enter with every single war, every single situation within the world is somehow ours to deal with and somehow ours to intervene on, and somehow we have to pick a side and we have to supply them with arms and do whatever else. And in some instances we actually directly put our military forces at risk. And I mean, of course, the biggest example of this is the Vietnam War, where you had, a limited basically understanding the history of this war will help you understand why intervention is such a bad idea. In 1954, the French were defeated in Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. Before that, the French had been there for some time, decades, and Indochina, which encompassed Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, were their basically provinces or protectorates or whatever you want to say. They were added into the French Empire. Well, when the Germans attacked France in World War II and the French government fell, you had the Vichy government that came to life, but that was just a Nazi puppet state. The Japanese took advantage of that situation and took over Indochina. The French at first were kind of tolerated, but it was made very clear to them that they had no power. And then after a while the Japanese finally just imprisoned them. Well, after World War II and Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan were defeated, the French wanted to return and reclaim their former colonial possessions. Obviously, the Vietnamese have had a little taste of freedom underneath the Japanese, and at least in some sense that it proved to them that an Asian power could defeat a European power. Because the Japanese, they saw the Japanese come in and remove the French from Indochina and lock them up in prison and things like that, so that galvanized the movement. But nevertheless, the French decided that they wanted to reclaim this colonial possession, and this is where things started taking a bad turn. Is we ended up paying almost 100% of their war bill to try to help them in this failed effort. This is something we never should have done. We never should have intervened in this matter. It had nothing to do with us. It was completely a French matter. We were basically bankrolling the enslavement of another country. That is, if that's not against Americanism, I don't know what is.
August 1945. After 80 years of colonial rule and 4 years of Japanese occupation, a new surge for independence sweeps French Indochina. As French troops return to Hanoi and to Saigon, symbol of France's Eastern Empire, European citizens welcome them. But many Vietnamese support a new nationalist government that claims most of Indochina. At the head of it, a hero of wartime resistance, Ho Chi Minh. At 55, Ho has become a legend. Communist, although many of his followers are not, Ho, trained in Moscow, educated in Paris, follows a pure nationalist line. He tells the French, "We want to govern ourselves, but we need your engineers and your capital." In March 1946, France recognizes Ho's Republic of Vietnam. Bao Dai, the Emperor of Annam, has abdicated to become Ho's political advisor. A pre-war French puppet, then a Japanese one, Bao Dai's basic French ties will see him again allied with France against Ho. Ho arrives in Paris to plead for complete independence, but his mission is doomed to failure. While he is away, French colonialists are creating a puppet regime in Saigon, and communist extremists are terrorizing Hanoi. Ho begs French liberals for support. You will not regret it, he says. He grants an exclusive interview to CBS News correspondent David Schoenbrun.
Ho came into the room that night wearing the uniform that had been made popular by Stalin, by Chiang Kai-shek. Just a simple khaki, high-collared uniform, no decorations, no insignia of any kind. And I said to him, President Ho, you keep talking about war. Is there going to be war between your people and the French? And to my astonishment, this president, in office, in time of peace, speaking in Paris, his allied country, replied, yes, there will be war. There's no way out. The French do not really recognize our independence. It's all a masquerade. We are not really independent. We mean to be, and there will be war. I looked at him and said, President Ho, how can you possibly fight war against the modern French army? You have nothing. You've just told me what a poor country you are. You don't even have a bank, let alone an army and guns and modern weapons. The French have planes, tanks, napalm. How can you fight the French? And he said, oh, we have a lot of things that can match the French weapons. Tanks are no good in swamps, and we have swamps in which the French tanks will sink. And we have another secret weapon. It's nationalism. And don't think that a small, ragged band cannot fight against a modern army. It will be a war between an elephant and a tiger. If the tiger ever stands still, the elephant will crush him and pierce him with his mighty tusks. But the tiger of Indochina is not going to stand still. We're going to hide in our jungles by day and steal out by night. And the tiger will jump on the back of the elephant and tear huge chunks out of his flesh and then jump back into the jungle. And after a while, the mighty elephant will bleed to death. That was the prediction of Ho Chi Minh on September 11th, 1946.
So, in 1954, the French were finally defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and that ended the French colonial rule there. That started a kind of Korea scenario where you had two countries break out. You had the South that was, supposedly a democracy, and in the North, you had a communist regime that was backed by China. So the United States and all the red paranoia at the time started bankrolling this regime in the South, which, that was a horrible mistake. It was bad enough that we married the French victory or loss to U.S. policy, to U.S. foreign policy. We should have never been attached to that failed effort, because it was basically endorsing something that is against Americanism and against what America stands for. It kind of takes away from the moral high ground when you justify one nation conquering another in this day and age. That's a kind of a barbaric practice. But nevertheless, we did marry ourselves to that defeat. So we took over bankrolling this kind of American puppet regime in the South. Now, that's not to say that the northern regime was any better. They weren't, and they had the typical communist purges and destruction of the middle class and all these other, abolishment of property and all the other ridiculous failed garbage that comes with socialism. So both regimes were pretty not good. And then from then on, American policy was to intervene in it. You had President Diem, which ended up he displeased us, and so the CIA kind of sponsored removing a coup against him. This is a South Vietnamese president, which ended up leading to his assassination, and then a bunch of puppet, little, basically a kind of banana republic situation where there was one president here and another president there, and it just became ridiculous. And I'm not going to go over America's military involvement. That should be well known by everybody by now, that we slowly started getting sucked into it. And at the height of it, there was 500,000 American soldiers there in Vietnam, a little over 500,000 actually. And from then on, the tragedy reigned on. But the big lesson to take away from the Vietnam tragedy is the fact that no matter how much money we pumped into that South Vietnamese government, no matter how many military advisors or actual combat troops, in the field we had of ours to supplement theirs, even with all that and all the effort and all the blood, it did not save the government of South Vietnam.
Tuesday, April 29th. The streets of Saigon, usually jammed with traffic at the morning rush hour, are quiet. The attack by communist aircraft at Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Airport the day before has prompted a 24-hour curfew. And the only people on the streets are ambulance drivers and policemen. With communist forces only a few miles from the center of Saigon, the order to evacuate American nationals is given. Americans and citizens of third countries who have been guaranteed space on the airlift gather at assembly points for the bus ride to Tan Son Nhut Airport. But the buses have to be abandoned when helicopters at Tan Son Nhut come under fire from both communist and South Vietnamese troops. Heavy shelling at the airport destroys planes on the ground, and American Marines are killed by rocket fire. Journalists filming the action from the roof of their hotel see a South Vietnamese helicopter shot down near the grounds of the presidential palace. At least 10 people die in the crash. The American ambassador, Graham Martin, took personal control of the evacuation. Marines used smoke to signal helicopters they should land on the lawn behind the embassy walls, where they would be protected from ground fire. For the frightened civilians, the first few hundred feet were the most dangerous. After that, they were out of range of rifle and pistol fire. The hardest part was the waiting. Many people said it was unnerving to be waiting for a ride to safety and to be hearing fighting all around you. There was always the fear that the fighting would end the helicopter. Those South Vietnamese not lucky enough to have been chosen for evacuation defied the curfew and stood outside the embassy gate, begging for a seat on the helicopters. Many of these people have relatives in Canada. Some carried visas issued by the Canadian Embassy in Saigon. But for most, it wasn't enough to get them a ride out. Embassy officials feared the crowd might again storm the gate, so they called in Marine reinforcements. The tension mounted as more and more Americans arrived in the compound and began the nerve-wracking wait for a way out. Americans who in better times flocked to the embassy pool for relaxation were back again. But this time they were anything but gay. As evening approached, Ambassador Martin emerged to join the others in making the flight to an American aircraft carrier some 40 miles offshore. More than 80 helicopters shuttling people out to the carriers. Everyone was searched before being allowed to join the other evacuees. South Vietnamese Army pilots flew their families to safety aboard the carriers as well. But because there wasn't room to store their helicopters as well as those flown by American pilots, the Vietnamese were forced to ditch their aircraft at sea. The pilots were picked up by American Navy rescue boats. dusk fell on Saigon, helicopters were still taking people out of the embassy compound. In all, approximately 7,000 people, most of them Vietnamese, were airlifted to safety during the 12-hour operation. Desperate Vietnamese remained at the embassy gate, hoping against hope that they too would be evacuated. But for them, there was to be no flight to safety.
So no matter how much money, no matter how much blood we put into South Vietnam, we could not save that government, no matter what we did, because it was too dependent upon us. They couldn't stand on their own. And when you do something like that, you prolong the agony of people, you know, by giving them this artificial bubble. Unless we're willing to stay with a Vietnam-level effort for generation after generation after generation, similar to what we did in Korea, there is no way military intervention of this kind will work. Not of value. There's just simply no way for that to happen. And you can see the exact same blueprint playing out again with Iraq, with the intervention there. No matter how much money or blood we infuse into that government in Baghdad, it still is incompetent. It still commits war crimes. It's still, you know, not truly a nation that can operate independently without being taken over by the crazies, no matter how much money we infuse into it. And I say again that both these interventions, Vietnam and Iraq, were interventions that were not vital to U.S. interests. There was no reason for us to be there, essentially. These were internal matters that they should have dealt with on their own. We could have handled it through sanctions, we could have handled it through various other means, but there was absolutely no reason that we should have picked up the banner for these folks and fought wars for them. One of the biggest reasons I voted for Donald Trump was because he promised not to get us entangled in any more foreign interventions. And I am sick of foreign interventions, having fought in one myself in Iraq, and my father having fought in Vietnam. My family, for one, has had enough of these type of wars. And I don't see any way they benefit the American people, or at the end of the day, I don't see how they benefit the people that were there to help either. Now, the problem is, Donald Trump has done some very disturbing moves since he's been in office. Number one, he's continuing the drone policy of Barack Obama. I've never seen much value in this. I understand taking out key commanders in ISIS and things of that nature. But the problem is that drone program seems to do more harm than it does good. So I was hoping that Donald Trump would look at it, but it seems like he just rubber stamped whatever Obama agreed with, and in some instances he seems to have even expanded it, which that's a problem.
देखो हम आम लोग के साथ जब बात करते हैं तो वो कहते हैं कि ये तारीकी रात का तपड़ है.
سمرة دي دا درون ولي دا مرا دشمن طول وزيرستان يز دشمن دا مرتا بگناك ناك نولي وزيرستان اخبل بلا نو دشمن يز اخبل دشمن رو دا كاچ بدرون ياك ناك
بل سردار پزراوي بگنا خلق مريجي پزراوي بچون قتل کیجي پزراوي بچون مينه بایجي و دې خدای نه مثال دا لکه د میج ولا
هغه کسونه چې سلکو لا بدغه مشپل قتل چاته پر دینه نه مفکوي.
From their point of view, this is not war. This is murder. And that's the way they look at it. It is recruiting terrorists all over the world. It's making young men and young women make the decision that the United States is their enemy and therefore worthy of their jihad.
ګریوان نصیحه دا زیوه نصیحه د خپل وینې انتقام میرزنه او خلیزګه چې د میرزه پښتې کلچر دا هداي.
The U.S. has killed a large number of people, and yet at the same time, instead of al-Qaeda growing less in Yemen, we're seeing in fact the exact opposite, that the more people we kill, it seems the larger in fact that al-Qaeda is growing.
The suspect is arrested in the Times Square bombing attempt.
Faiz al-Shahzad, who was a Pakistani national who was engaged in the attempt to blow up Times Square. The motivation that he put forward for his attack was that he'd witnessed a series of drone strikes, and so he was mounting an attack on a US city in retaliation. The Faisal Shahzad attack on Times Square is one example, but there are other possibilities.
This video made by the FBI shows agents detonating a bomb that the government says was identical to the components that Shahzad
Bomb
had assembled.
investigators found propane tanks, powder, and an apparent timing device.
This Shahadi attack will be the first of the revenge operations against the Americans and their drone teams.
Another terror attack killing at least 78 people.
The deadliest attack ever on a Christian minority in Pakistan. The Taliban says the attack was in retaliation for U.S. drone strikes.
उन्होंने बोला कि अब हमें कोई ज़रूरत नहीं है खुदकश हमला और तैयार करने के लिए। मैंने खुद देखा है कि जिस गांव में ड्रोन होता है वहां पर
Who is exactly cashing in on putting drones in our skies?
Defense and aerospace firms which build drones have spent millions of dollars on lobbying over the past year.
Another issue is the Syria strike on supposedly the base where those chemical weapons attack, or where the chemical weapons attack came from the Syrian regime. I don't think that was a well thought out military strike.
Want to hear it? Because you're going to hear it. This was not sarin gas, number one. It looks like phosgene gas. I realize those are big words for those in the media who are ready to put on military uniforms on their radio and television shows. This was a complete false flag event, and I'll give you some evidence, and you decide for yourself whether this thing is a fake or not. First of all, let's start from the beginning. Was this a strategic move that had the approval of Congress, approval of the UN? Were any U.S. interests threatened by Assad? Assad was fighting ISIS, for God's sakes. He had ISIS on the run with the help of Russia. What happened? Who just won? Why, we just helped ISIS. Isn't that what McCain and Lindsey Graham are celebrating? So we've just turned 180 degrees. Bannon was out, Kushner was in, and all of a sudden the strike was launched. I told that to you yesterday.
It was not necessary. There was no reason to do that. It really agitated the situation with the Russians. I mean, yeah, maybe it scared the hell out of Kim Jong-un or something, but, and that's another thing, ratcheting up the heat on Kim Jong-un the way he did was extremely reckless. I mean, it may have pleased warmongers like John McCain, who have never seen a war they didn't love. And, you know, his national security advisor, who seems to be the main leaker out of the National Security Council, McMaster's, seems to really endorse this kind of aggressive gunboat diplomacy. But it certainly doesn't win us any friends internationally, and it causes the likelihood of a military engagement of a heavy, heavy cost to break out. For example, something against, you know, easily could be a miscalculation between us and the Russians that could result in a third world war. You mustn't forget that North Korea has Seoul hostage all the time. They have thousands of artillery pieces and ballistic missiles ready to go and fire on that city, and it could kill millions of South Koreans in an instant. This is not a game. And you cannot sit there and run your mouth and send out tweets and think that you're not going to exacerbate a very tense situation. And it shows a lot of American arrogance when he can sit there and tweet and agitate the situation, but the South Koreans are going to be the ones to feel the brunt if Kim Jong-un wakes up one day and takes his tweet the wrong way and starts a war.
Here's what I find concerning. It traveled an altitude of 1,200 miles, a distance of 435 miles, only 60 miles shy of Russia. The altitude factor, if you change the angle of that, you can go a lot further away. Nonetheless, this would have encompassed all of Japan and all of South Korea. What finds you concerned about that now?
That's right. It's a medium-range ballistic missile, which means essentially it's got the capability to reach U.S. air bases in the Pacific, including Guam. So in that sense, this test constitutes a direct threat to U.S.
U.S. Special Operations Forces are ready to strike at North Korea's nuclear facilities and other sites housing weapons of mass destruction in the event of a future conflict. Testifying to Congress on Wednesday, Army General Raymond Thomas said elite U.S. military commandos have been training to neutralize the regime's nuclear and missile capabilities if necessary. He also said the threat of an increasingly rogue North Korea was no longer a regional concern, but has global implications.
U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson called on North Korea to trust Washington, that it's not seeking regime change, and that a halt to the North's nuclear activities could lead to talks. The top diplomat's comments suggest America is continuing to push for engagement with Pyongyang.
Now President Trump is in Saudi Arabia with, talking about this massive arms deal and setting up some sort of a Arab NATO, which I call the Arab Warsaw Pact, because if he thinks they're going to be doing our bidding, he's out of his mind. I think the worst thing you could do is have some kind of a Wahhabist-led Arab coalition of armies. That is just absolutely ridiculous. Plus giving them weapon systems that will allow the Saudis to go on the offensive. I have no problem with giving them weapons to protect themselves against the Iranians, but I don't like the idea of giving them a bunch of weapons so they can keep up with their wars in Yemen and invade other nations and then offensively attack Iran, which that's going to exacerbate the situation with Russia, which will begin putting in tons of arms and weapons into Iran. And then you could see us putting in, I promise, if this weapons deal goes forward, you're going to see another massive weapons deal from Putin to Iran very soon. And then it's going to start an arms race in the Middle East. And next thing you know, all those weapons are going to be used for something. They're not going to buy all these weapons for no reason. They're going to be used. I promise you that. And that's why this type of weapons deal is an absolutely horrendously stupid idea. And even worse idea is setting up this kind of Arab NATO. Absolutely ridiculous.
One of the Middle East's bloodiest conflicts is also one of its most overlooked. It's not Syria or Iraq. It's in a different place entirely, Yemen. The 20-month-old civil war there has killed more than 10,000 people and triggered a massive humanitarian crisis. But press coverage has been minimal, overshadowed by the fight against ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. In Yemen, one side has Houthi rebels, backed by Iran. On the other, you have the former Yemeni government of Abdrabbu Mansur al-Hadi, backed by a coalition of 10 countries, led by neighboring Saudi Arabia, who is ultimately also backed by the US. The civil war there erupted in 2015, when the Houthis, a Shiite group who received money and weapons from Iran, took up arms to overthrow Yemen's government, which is Sunni, and backed by Saudi Arabia. The Houthis complain that the government discriminated against them for years, mistreating them on a large scale, and that their fight is a fight to be treated fairly. Many in the region, by contrast, see it very differently. They think it's the latest front in a shadow war between Saudi Arabia and Iran for control over the entire region. In March of 2015, Saudi Arabia began bombing Houthi-held territory across Yemen, causing mass civilian casualties. They've destroyed targets ranging from marketplaces to hospitals, from schools, and even to a funeral recently, where 140 people were killed in a single strike. In August, the Saudis bombed the vital port of Hodeidah, severely damaging a main source of Yemen's food and humanitarian aid shipments, and increasing the chances of mass starvation in what is already an impoverished country. The indiscriminate bombing has prompted investigations by the UN for possible war crimes.
Amnesty International filmed this footage close to the northern city of Sadr, a Houthi stronghold. Local villager Qasem Salah al-Shaiba says the airstrikes destroyed his house. He denies any link to the rebels and shows a picture of his dead son.
This is the weapon. This is the weapon they claimed we had. This is the weapon. The Quran, the mosque.
Amnesty looked into 13 airstrikes by the coalition between May and July in Sadr.
In one direct airstrike we looked into and visited the site in July, there were a cluster of 9 houses, and there were 4 consecutive airstrikes that were spaced out over 2 hours. 55 people were killed, 35 of which were children under the age of 11.
Amnesty also claims to have found the remains of cluster munitions banned under international treaties. Saudi Arabia did not respond directly to Amnesty's accusations, but has said in the past that it only targets rebel fighters and has denied using cluster bombs.
And we're asking for all states to first of all suspend, and specifically the US, the arms transfer to all members of the coalition, given that there are war crimes being committed, and 2, for the international community to investigate these war crimes.
The American people and the world have had enough of America's interventionist policy. It doesn't help us, it doesn't help them. The only people it helps are the arms industry or the military-industrial complex and the deep state. These are folks that Donald Trump was elected to destroy and fragment, not to join forces with.